Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Hi. So, recently a friend asked me to make a video talking about Jordan Peterson. And in particular, what should Christians make of Jordan Peterson? Now, let me preface this by saying I'm a fan of Jordan Peterson. I've watched many of his videos. I enjoy them. I think he makes some very good points and some very good observations. Jordan Peterson is not a professed Christian. What he is... Oh, let me also specify. I don't know what he is in his heart. He hasn't specified. In fact, he sort of famously hasn't specified. Publicly speaking. And, so I'm not trying to delve into the soul of Jordan Peterson. I don't have that gift, seeing into souls. And I don't know him anyway. What this is talking about is what should someone in the position of presumably you and certainly me, that is to say somebody who just watches his videos on YouTube and sees things he says in other contexts, what should we make of him from a Christian perspective? Because of course Jordan Peterson does not talk like he does not talk like a Christian. He says a number of things that Christians are very sympathetic to. But of course he does so in a very, very different way. And now this could go in one of two ways, of course. He could be simply really not coming from a Christian perspective, which means almost certainly not coming from a perspective compatible with Christianity. And the other thing is he could be essentially translating. Translating into a language that a secular materialistic sort of person, materialism, like naturalism, sort of way, would understand. Now, the real question is, as I said, not, what's in the man's soul, but rather, what are we to make of him in terms of a consistent position that a Christian can, really listen to with only the sort of normal reservations one uses for, listening to Christians. Because, all people are fallible, so you have to be careful. All right, so first, to give a nutshell of my take, I think that he is groping his way towards Christianity. And I think he is doing so in a way that is reasonably compatible with Christianity. Now, I don't think, it's rare to find a person who is perfectly consistent. If you are an Orthodox Christian, then you get sort of that privilege of actually being consistent. Otherwise, it gets harder. And if you are, at all in the modern materialistic sort of position, you're not even slightly consistent. It's something readily observed. Now, if you look at him, one of the first things that strikes me about Jordan Peterson's videos is you can hear pain in the man's voice 95% of the time he speaks, something like that. It's really kind of curious, and that's the way I am struck anyway. His history certainly involves a lot of struggle as a young man and a lot of worry, and he went through, various things that caused difficulty in his life, especially in his young life, and he talks about that in some videos. But I don't think it's just residual pain. He started off or is otherwise stuck in this very materialistic sort of framework. And I most recently listened to pieces, but a 2-hour podcast he did where he talked about mythology and religion and so on. And I think it serves as a good entry point into looking at this by way of the distinction he made between what he called roughly rationalistic truth and evolutionary truth. Darwinian truth, actually, was the term he used. Roughly speaking, that rationalistic truth is the sort of thing you get post the Enlightenment. It's purely discursive. It's purely like in terms of formal logic or mathematics, roughly speaking. And to a great degree, interestingly, he used Richard Dawkins to symbolize this. That Richard Dawkins is a man who, frankly, the guy is not particularly rational or anything. What he is really, at its heart, is a man who doesn't understand metaphor. It's common of all the new atheists. If you look at them, they don't know what other people mean if other people are not speaking in painfully literal language about things in ordinary experience, by and large. It's a common theme running throughout them. Something I think I've commented on before. Pretty easy to observe. So, and that stands in very well for the sort of Enlightenment, modern science sort of approach. One of the big things about it is very much something from the outside. The whole idea is, you're an observer looking at something else. You're not taking part in it. You're only measuring the things that an outside observer could see from the outside. You're restricting yourself to that which is, empirically measurable. And of course, the thing about things that are empirically measurable is they're completely unambiguous. If you say that something is 3.1742 meters, there's only one meaning to that. There's only one possible meaning to that. There's no metaphorical reading of that. There's one thing everyone agrees on. You hear it, you know what it means. You don't need to know context, you just know the meaning. It's very, very simple. And there is a lot that was useful in this, although the actual history of science involves way more praising of science in general, when in fact, there are many sciences. And, for example, chemistry has done wildly well, and astronomy has done pretty well, and physics has done very well, minus the fact that it's got, two theories that don't agree with each other, whatever. Those have done fairly well. Other sciences not nearly as well, depending on what you want to look at. Like biology is still at the very beginning of understanding how biology actually works. We've made some breakthroughs in terms of DNA, but how DNA actually works, if you really delve into this, it's really, really complicated. Because of course, there are things like not all DNA is expressed, and so which parts of DNA are expressed, it actually is related to the machinery in the cell, which parts of the DNA get expressed. And so, and not everything in the cell comes from the DNA, but a lot of it does, in terms of the proteins that get transcribed and so on, that then eventually, go back into what is expressed. So if you without getting into this any further than that, if you just go look at it, you'll find out, especially because the machinery in the cell also did things like comes from your mother intact, so it's not all just from your DNA. And so it's very, very complicated. We don't understand how it's complicated. Further, the interactions of different organisms that, like bacteria and so on, with larger multicellular organisms that go up to make, the entire person, those things we are just scratching the surface of figuring out that we need to understand. Biology is incredibly, incredibly, phenomenally complex, and we know very, very, very little in biology. And Richard Dawkins, of course, is deeply in love with the theory of evolution, probably because there's nothing to learn about it. Would be a tangent if I went into this. So just suffice it to say that the theory of evolution is stated in biology is essentially that allele frequency changes in a population over time. And you can study this. It doesn't predict anything in the sense of you can't look at an organism and say what it's going to become, or look at an organism in its environment and say what it's going to become. You can infer the existence of intermediate things looking back, and people talk about predictions there, and maybe even there's a little bit of use. I don't find lots of intermediates. That's another thing too. Bear in mind, I think the theory of evolution is a perfectly reasonable scientific theory that may very well, in fact, be the origin of speciation. So I'm not talking against evolution. I'm just saying it doesn't have the same thing as chemistry. In chemistry, you make things like tires. You can cause tires that don't wear out over 100 miles, but take tens of thousands of miles to wear out because you mix chemicals and come up with an amazing tire. With the theory of evolution, you write popular books. That's about it. You don't do anything with it. You don't make anything. People have been breeding animals long before the theory of evolution. Theory of evolution does you no good in dog breeding because dog breeders already knew how to do it before. Genetic markers and stuff are not, by the way, the theory of evolution. Those are genetic markers. So biology has some uses, not nearly as much as chemistry. Chemistry is amazing. What chemistry has done is truly astonishing. And probably, between chemistry and physics, they're the ones that have done the most. As you get out of those, though, looking into other sciences, it gets really, really iffy how much has actually been done. Even the more fringe stuff in biology. There's a ton of biology which is on the ash heap of history, in whole or in part. So, to what degree has that science actually been so gloriously triumphant? It's a lot more arguable than people make out. But nonetheless, within our cultural framework, that's been, gloriously successful within its very narrow field. Not very good at making people happy, but it's very good at making tools. Sometimes those tools make you happy, sometimes they don't. sometimes those tools just massively add to your stress. Like, a lot of people curse the person who invented the alarm clock. Anyway, point being, that's an entire way of thinking. That thing, but because it often results in very unhappy people, in the sense that there are very unhappy people in the world, this has not prevented that, and therefore, the mixture of the two still results in very unhappy people. And Jordan Peterson's a psychologist. He studies, to a great, unhappiness. That's sort of what he's looked at to a great degree. The result being, he contrasted the Darwinian approach to truth, which is, what actually works, roughly speaking. And he looked at, look at what, actually works in organisms. And I don't want to trace out his argument in that podcast, but loosely speaking, he said that another way of looking at truth is not, is this a measurably confirmable fact about something, but does it actually help you to be happy? And I'm oversimplifying his argument, but, or I'm not really presenting his argument, I'm oversimplifying the approach, but the relevant point is that, roughly speaking, he does essentially presuppose that he doesn't state this outright, but he presupposes essentially that it is the nature of a human being to be happy, that this is achievable and proper. Roughly speaking, he is presupposing that the world is rationally ordered to the good, and therefore it is possible, imperfect of course, but it is possible to take part in that in a way that results in you being happy, which is you being rationally ordered to the good. Now, he's always very, very cagey, because we live in a time when you can't actually assume anything. I mean, people assume things, but you can't actually say that you're assuming anything. You have to pretend that you're not assuming things while you assume them. This way you never examine your assumptions, and you minimize the chance of you actually being happy. And that's one of the things, of course, that he doesn't like. Because it's completely non-functional to just, take whatever you've been given, not think about it, because if you thought about it, you have to say, well, I can't really know it. With knowledge defined in that very, very limited, you can measure it in a way that everyone can measure it and confirm exactly, and only the things other people can measure and confirm count as truth. It's not useful. It's not useful to produce happy people. Now, people like Richard Dawkins, of course, are very happy to simply utterly ignore this and be radically inconsistent whenever they feel like it, and then look down on people who are more consistent than them. I'm not a fan of Richard Dawkins, if that's not clear. I think anyone who's watched my channel will know that I'm not a fan of Richard Dawkins, but, the thing about this approach, because this is not like, I'm doing this because it makes me happy. That, of course, everyone disagrees with, especially because it doesn't work. This thing makes me happy in the short term, therefore I'm going to do it, is, generally speaking, a path to misery. And Jordan Peterson knows that better than, most of the, scientific, materialist thinking people that he really primarily addresses. It's rather a very different sort of thing that he asks. And it's in this thing where he talks a lot about evolutionary psychology. And the curious thing about evolutionary psychology is that it either directly speaks to people or it sounds like wild bunk. Now, the thing about that is that I think evolutionary psychology is really, properly speaking, mythology for people who can't accept ordinary mythology. And so, some of it almost has the feeling of a long time ago in the early days of men, there was a man named Jung who walked from his village and wandered the earth until he, reached some mountaintop and discovered there the truth that the village myths actually had truth in them. He just didn't understand them. It almost has that sort of feel to it. And I think it makes sense that he is, to a degree, spinning new myths. Not just him, but, he does it. He's a good storyteller. He's a very good storyteller. And he spins these myths that explain how myths have truth in them. And so he tells these stories about, lobsters turning, lobsters to wolves to monkeys. And he didn't say that the one turned into the other, but, tracing stages of development in different organisms. But, given that he didn't say that, you might as well have talked about how the lobster turned into a wolf, who turned into a chimp, who turned into us, and how they, came to understand these different things about the nature of reality. And this, because the literal truth of it doesn't matter, to his point, The literal truth of it does not matter to the point he was making. He was illustrating the utility of myths in teaching you greater truths about the nature of reality. His focus was on what he called dominance hierarchies, but essentially just interaction of the interaction of organisms. And by the way, the another way to talk about the interaction of organisms is morality. So you can talk about dominance hierarchies and surviving or thriving in dominance hierarchies, but this is the same thing as talking about morality. And what he ended up doing in this talk was essentially giving a description of natural law morality within the context of a essentially evolutionary myth. And the thing about this, of course, is, as a Christian listening to him, it's one of those, there's this odd psychological thing that goes on because, we're used to saying what we mean. And we're used to, either directly saying what we mean when we're the ones talking, really, or we're used to hearing, non-literal language in places where we expect it to be non-literal language. So, for example, when Jesus tells a parable, we do very much expect it to be a parable. We don't expect it to be literal. Or when you look at the literary form called myth, which, by the way, doesn't mean not true. It just means that the literal part is not the part which contains the largest lesson. Myth can be true or false in the literal sense, but it is true in the metaphor. The thing about myth is that it is true in the metaphorical sense, whether it is true or false in the literal sense. Thus, you can have the mythology of something that happened, like the mythology of D-Day, about how enormous numbers of people went and stormed beaches in France. It happened. And you can use, you can tell the story of this selecting bits and pieces, and you spin a mythology because you're telling the story to convey a broader truth, not as a direct account of the history, but that would be an example of a myth which is true. There's the founding myths. Many countries have their founding myths in one degree or another. The United States has founding myths about the revolution from England, which are literally true, but that's not the point. That's not the point. Americans don't take the literal aspects of it very importantly. They're the broader things about the America being a nation founded on ideals, and how the thing that's supposed to unite us is a shared belief in certain ideals about things like the dignity of human beings. So again, myth doesn't mean false. Myth just means that there's a much bigger, more universal point. Now, the myths that he would tell about this, they're not in a place where you're expecting them to be myths. He doesn't really tell them as myths. I mean, he doesn't tell them not as myths either. He doesn't say, the following is literally true. In fact, what he would tend to say is, forget about whether or not it's literally true for a minute and consider this, which I guess is becoming something of the, modern introduction to a myth rather than, in the beginning or, in old times before men, before men had degenerated. There are different introductions, classically speaking, and, our founding fathers, you'll hear a lot of that in American myths. So every every group of myths tends to have its characteristic introduction. I suppose, stop worrying about whether or not this is literally true, but, consider might be the modern evo-psych beginning of a myth. And, I'm just not used to it. Generally, I think we're not used to it. So, it's strange, and he is telling myths in a place where we would simply say the literal truth. We would say God exists. We wouldn't talk about, because a lot of what he does is say, stop asking the question of whether God really does or does not exist in a testable, measurable sense. Because, of course, as Christians, we see God, you can see God's handiwork in creation in a variety of ways that testify to God, whether it is, the rational ordering of the universe, the, governance of the universe, it's called, whether as the, in the ways St. Thomas mentioned, the argument from contingency and necessity, the argument from the argument from efficient cause, the argument from motion or change, the the argument from beauty, the argument from morality. There are a lot of different arguments whereby you can know that God is true in that sense of anybody looking at this should be able to come to the same conclusion. If they don't, they're defective. On the other hand, that sort of thing is not really an askable question to a lot of people. Like, a lot of people can't consider that. And so, whereas Christians, this is highly concerning to us. That this is something, we spend a lot of time thinking about, and we're often not very good at dealing with people who just can't do it for whatever reason. And that, I think, is Jordan Peterson's audience. And to a degree, I think he's in it. To a degree, I think, he's going along this path and also at the same time helping other people to sort of get onto the path that he's on, trying to find something better than the complete sort of nihilism of a Richard Dawkins-like position. Dawkins just has a sort of, childlike simplicity to him where he just never questions anything and does, pretty much, almost exactly what he was told as a child. But for people who don't have that sort of simplicity, who don't just sort of mindlessly do whatever they were told as a child, with, a few minor details, rebelled against the church for whatever reason, the Church of England, I mean. But that aside, Jordan Peterson's audience is very different. They're people who can't really accept that, who have trouble with the fundamental nihilism of it, but also don't know how to escape. Don't have the escape of the fundamental nihilism by way of being kind of dimwits, like Richard Dawkins is. And so those are the people to whom Jordan Peterson is speaking. And these people are, I think, very much in the position of being sick. They're like people in a hospital. And, if you look at how people interact with very sick people, you don't worry so much about literal truth. You don't say to a person like, okay, this is, when I withdraw this splinter, from your hand, it's going to hurt precisely, 17.3 units of pain for, the first few seconds, diminishing within, a relatively like exponential but kind of flat curve, so it kind of goes like that. You don't say that sort of thing. You don't explain it in those sort of terms. You talk to a person in very metaphorical language, saying like, don't think about the splinter, think about something else. It'll be okay. You don't need to worry about this. Just focus on something else while, ow! You'll be better now. Like, that's the way you talk to a person who is in serious trouble, who's in a lot of pain where there's a way of fixing it. And that is, it seems to me, the way Jordan Peterson tends to talk. He doesn't tend to talk in, like this is true, this is false in a, empirically verifiable sort of sense. He tends to talk in that, like, stop thinking about the stuff that won't do you any good. Because right now you're in a world of trouble, and your life is a mess, and that's a bad place to be. You need to fix that before you can worry about other things. So let's start off with fixing how your life is a complete mess, and then let's start off with figuring out why your life is a complete mess. And ultimately, I think that what Jordan Peterson is doing is attempting to get a person to stop asking the right questions at the wrong time is probably the best case interpretation. But I think what he's kind of doing, that it's not that you can never ask questions like, can anybody, can I really tell that God exists in the sort of way that anybody who isn't defective should be able to come to the same conclusion as me? He's not, because, and this is where he kind of famously just won't answer that sort of question. Even when pressed in interviews, I mean. He never brings it up himself. It seems to me much more that he is taking the approach of, stop asking this sort of question because you're not in a position to answer it. You can't come to an answer either way right now. And since you can't, this is not helping you. You need to get yourself to a place where you can worry about that sort of thing later. And considered in that sort of way, he's got a very pragmatist approach. The way he described it is, one way of looking at things is that it doesn't matter whether or not God really exists, as long as believing in God. The relevant question within this way of looking at it is whether or not believing in God leads you to live a good life in which you are happy. Not like a moral life or a life convenient for your neighbors, but a life directed towards the sort of goodness that brings you happiness. And while that is not the way a Christian looks at it, because of course a Christian looks at it first and foremost as the thing that matters more than anything is the truth. Of course, the truth is our Lord and Savior. As Jesus famously said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So we're kind of preoccupied with that question, which is one reason why natural science really, really flourished in a Christian world. Not quite exclusively, but it was really, it really feels very, very Christian in a way that it doesn't, it is compatible with other things, but it is a proper Christian fascination to ask about the world that God made and to try to understand it in a way that is compatible, but not like a proper, typical fascination of, say, well, I mean, it's kind of inappropriate to a Buddhist, but, a Hindu could do it if they wanted, but there's no particular drive to it in the same way that, when you see science within a Christian setting, it just makes utter sense. And so we have that fascination, but Jordan Peterson isn't dealing with the sort of people who are capable of doing that right now, really. And so he seems to be much more in the position of saying, stop with all of this, because you just can't. For whatever reason, you can't. And the thing is, the pragmatic approach, it doesn't matter whether or not God really exists. The only question that matters is whether or not believing in God is useful. And useful not in a trivial, short-sighted sense, but like, how does it cause you to orient your life? And does it cause you to orient your life towards happiness or towards misery? That pragmatic approach is, that is not the right way to live your life. It's got an indifference to the truth, which is simply wrong. It makes a lot of sense as a medicine, though. And so the fundamental question about how do you want to take Jordan, as a Christian, how should you take Jordan Peterson, comes down to whether or not you can think of what he's doing in medicinal terms. Now, the man treats patients. For his living, his life is kind of focused around treating patients. So, it makes sense that he would be thinking in very, very medicinal terms. There are other types of medicine, of course, but that, I think, is the thing. I'm not saying that everyone should trust him. In general, there are very few of the sons of men that I think one should put one's full trust in. In fact, they're kind of none. You should put your full trust in God or else in nobody. There's, no person who's worthy of it, no human being who is worthy of it. But in terms of what you do with him, that, I think, is ultimately speaking the crux. Can you see the problem that he's trying to solve? Can you see the worldview that is just utterly incapable of thinking about truth as anything other than essentially that which is empirically measurable? Because if a person's stuck in that, they can't really move on to anything else. I mean, if they could, they would, pretty directly, because it's a pretty miserable failure. In terms of, human happiness, and people do want to be happy by and large. I know there are people who will disagree with me, and I know what they mean. Just the sort of misery that those people are trying to wrap themselves into tends to be, a misguided seeking of happiness. There are also people who just want to be miserable. Hell is a real possibility. But for a great many people, they want to be happy, so something as utterly irrational and just miserable as modern nihilistic materialism is the sort of thing that if a person can get out of it, they will. The people who are trapped in it are people who need help getting out of it for one reason or another. And so that, I think, is the key. If you can see Jordan Peterson as that, if you can see him as a lifeline thrown out to somebody drowning in the water, you never, ever would build you would never treat a lifeline in the water to a drowning man as a foundation upon which to build a building. In the same way, you should never take a sort of pragmatic pragmatism in place of truth as a foundation for building a proper philosophical system. It's not. It's not the same sort of thing at all. It's really a way of getting yourself to a place in which you can actually start to build. That is absolutely its utility. I think it does actually serve that purpose for some people. It would certainly be a mistake if somebody started from a firm foundation and moved to a purely pragmatic approach, like, it doesn't really matter that Jesus Christ actually did rise from the dead and, genuinely and literally is the unbegotten Son of the uncreated creator of all it is. Whatever. I'm just going to be practical in terms of what works. That would be terrible. That would be awful. That is not at all what Jordan Peterson is suggesting. The very fact that he famously refuses to comment on the literal truth of it, because if Christianity is literally true, then all of the metaphorical descriptions he gives of it, the deeper truths about, the deep truths about life that Christianity points to, would still be exactly as true as he was describing them. You would just have the added benefit of, the thing being literally true. So there's absolutely nothing in it that contradicts what Jordan Peterson is saying. And as a result, there is nothing in what Jordan Peterson is saying that contradicts Christianity. You just have to be able to look at it as that sort of temporary way to help somebody who is in a lot of trouble. And I do think, incidentally, although this is very a little bit close to talking about the man, in himself, but in support of this, just in terms of, where does he plan to go? Is he laying traps for people or genuinely trying to help them? Because that is a question of public interest. If you look at his videos, whenever he is talking, as I mentioned earlier, there's pain in his voice, which you hear a lot of the time, and the pain always seems deepest to me when he's talking about the materialistic world that he is trying to escape. That a Dawkinsian way of looking at things is. The more he is describing that, the more pain you can hear in his voice. The more you can hear the. Because it's pretty much always when he is describing dysfunction. Because, of course, the dysfunction comes from that sort of fundamental misorientation to the universe. All right, so I'm mixing his perspective and mine a little bit, obviously. But that's where you see most of the pain. When he's telling the stories of mythology, that's when you hear the least pain in his voice. So the closer he gets to the Dawkinsian view of life, the more pain you hear in his voice. The closer he gets to the religious view of life, the less pain you hear in his voice. And it's fairly consistent throughout. There's when he's talking about religion in the podcast where he was, but listen to him talk about things like picking careers or cleaning your room or, any number of subjects. Within those lectures, they tend to be, bite-sized philosophy has a lot of them, 3 to 10 minutes roughly. And within those, whenever he's, listen to where he sounds the most pained, and it's always when he's talking about the dysfunction of that Dawkinsian worldview. And where he seems least pained is always on the other side, which suggests to me very, very much, because the thing is, I can talk about either, and neither of them pains me. Because, of course, the one is entirely hypothetical for me. I can talk about life within a Dawkinsian worldview. It's really tight and cramped. It's not, pleasant to talk within that. But I can hypothetically talk about things within that view. I can talk about how, within this, yourself is an immanent thing. That is to say, there's nothing in you that transcends time. So part of yourself is always fading out as you're, losing your memory, and part, you're always building into yourself. And so, for example, within an immanent self, you don't have redemption. There's no possibility of redemption because whatever you've done. But since part of you is fading, as time's moving on, part of you is fading, part of you is being added, it has a somewhat similar effect to redemption. So, I can talk about that sort of thing, and it doesn't pain me in the least because it's purely hypothetical. When you listen to Jordan Peterson, I think the reason why you hear pain as he's in this is he has not escaped it. He wants to escape it. He wants desperately to be out of it. He is desperately, at the same time, trying to cling to the truths of religion, whether or not, there's the literal truth behind it. He's trying to cling to the deeper truths of it. And so, as a man who is trapped, in that, who is, essentially trying to claw his way out of the ocean with, what seems like a, rope that he's found that, helps him to get out, I don't think, I think that he can be trusted to a degree in that sense. Again, none of the sons of men should be, fully trusted. But at the same time, he is, I think, he's not laying traps. that is at least my, as far as I can tell, I don't think anyone needs to worry about whether or not he is laying traps. And to explain, I've had people. This is coming from conversations where I've had where there are people who don't agree with me about this. Or at least I believe they don't agree with me about this. That was my take on what they were saying. So this is not me making something up. This is me arguing for a particular interpretation against other interpretations I have heard. So that ultimately, I think, putting it together is, in summary, I think what a Christian should make of Jordan Peterson. Should not in the moral sense, but as, in the sense of is I think a pretty reasonable take on it. That I think he is very sincerely trying. He is not laying traps either intentionally or unintentionally. And if understood as medicine, then, in a medicinal sense or in a therapeutic sort of sense, as a, let's set aside the question of normal functioning because we're not near normal functioning. Normal functioning being a fundamental orientation towards truth. So, the first question is is this fully true? And instead it's a question of you're not ready to ask questions about is this fully true. Let's just worry about the big stuff, is this true in the most important sense, and then we can figure out how do you find that most important truth combined with the less pragmatic aspects of truth to get the unity of truth later, once you've actually gotten the big truth first, because it does you no good to hold on to a few scraps of truth that keep you from getting at the fullness of truth. And that is fundamentally a reasonable approach in cases where a person simply is so fixated on one thing that they can't broaden their horizons. So that ultimately is my take on Jordan Peterson. And as I said, I was asked to do this, so that's the best I can, because Jordan Peterson is confusing to a lot of Christians. And so I hope this was helpful to people having that difficulty. And once again, I just want to reiterate, I enjoy watching his videos. I'm a fan of Jordan Peterson. Nothing I've said is meant as a criticism of Jordan Peterson, but rather he does pose certain problems to a group of people, namely Christians, and so here's my attempt to try to help. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.